If you were left with strong opinions on, let's just say, certain aspects of 28 years later, this video is going to be fun. In the early 2000s, filmmaker Neil Marshall garnered a reputation in the indie horror scene when he followed his cult debut military action werewolf creature feature Dog Soldiers with the claustrophobic spelunking 2005 survival horror The Descent. At the time, it was lauded as one of the scariest films to come out of Britain and went on to achieve a global box office success of over $57 million against its £3.5 million budget. As such, like many indie auteur filmmakers, this capital and industry goodwill gave Marshall the leverage to obtain a budget over 5 times his previous films to basically make whatever he wanted, assuming he was now a fairly safe bet within the horror genre. However, his third film strayed significantly from the subtlety and minimalism that made The Descent so prolific, and instead indulged in his pure, unapologetic passion for the genre cinema exhibited in Dog Soldiers. The result was a completely batshit insane Frankenstein's hybrid of copy and paste from every high-concept film from the 70s and 80s, most primarily the works of John Carpenter and George Miller. Now, just to condense the exhaustive list of influences down to a few key examples to give you an idea, Neil Marshall's 2008 post-apocalyptic dystopian sci-fi action horror fantasy epic Doomsday, fuck me, that's a lot of genres, is basically what if Mad Max, Escape from New York, The Warriors, 28 Days Later, and Excalibur and Gladiator had a beautifully gory baby. In fact, if you're still somehow not sold on this overly worded genre love letter, if you actually open the Wikipedia page for this film, you can read a literal breakdown of every single film Neil Marshall used as inspiration and how he specifically incorporated it into the film. And oh boy, it is not subtle. Set in 2035, Doomsday tells the story of a future Britain struggling with increasing crime, poverty, and civil unrest as a result of mass overpopulation following the quarantine of Scotland over 25 years prior, when it was ravaged by a flesh-eating plague known as the Reaper virus. However, when it's discovered that the virus has returned and is spreading amongst the harshest and most impoverished parts of the City of London, the Prime Minister and his shadowy cabinet assign a covert team to infiltrate the remnants of Scotland in the hopes of finding an ill-fated cure. Naturally, as expected, shit hits the fan almost immediately when it's discovered that the survivors of the outbreak within the quarantine have either become psychotic punk sadomasochist cannibals or have reverted to the primitive culture of the Dark Ages. If you thought 28 Years Later was ambitious, you are about to experience the most utterly insane and transcendent stylistic whiplash ever put to screen. But here's the thing, like 28 Years Later, I absolutely adore Doomsday. It's not the most narratively coherent film by any means, but it is ADHD levels of pure entertainment. It is a genre stream of consciousness, flowing from action to horror to sci-fi to medieval fantasy to a car commercial. If there's one thing you can say for sure, it is undoubtedly cinema. Now, just before we go any further, this video is sponsored by ZocDoc. Have you ever been like me where you get sick or injured but struggle to get a doctor's appointment in a timely manner and thus end up putting off scheduling one entirely? For example, last year, I was dealing with a shoulder impingement that initially took me a few weeks to get booked in with my GP before being put on a waiting list for an x-ray that took several months, and it wasn't until a few months after that did I finally see an orthopedic specialist. That's just one of many times where I've struggled to get a convenient doctor's appointment without resorting to expensive private treatment, whether it be for injury, sickness, or mental health. If that sounds like you, ZocDoc is a free website where you can search and compare high-quality in-network doctors, choose one that suits your needs, and instantly book an appointment. ZocDoc catalogs over 100,000 healthcare providers ranging from mental health to dental to eye care to skin care and much more, and you can filter via specialty, location, insurance compatibility, and ratings by verified patients. You can actually actually see each provider's individual appointment times and choose one that works for you, which is especially handy if you're at work or have kids, or like me, you're just chaotically busy all the time. ZocDoc appointments can happen fast within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, with same-day appointments without the hassle of talking to anyone or waiting online or on the phone. All you need to do is click the link in the description below or visit ZocDoc.com/ryanhollinger to easily book local top-rated doctors who can see you quickly today. Thanks to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video. Now, just before we get into the specifics of the plot, I want to take a moment to address Neil Marshall, because I've actually already covered his fantastic first two films, Dog Soldiers and The Descent, but along with Doomsday, I like to unofficially consider these films collectively as Neil Marshall's unholy trinity of British horror. The thing is, I would argue at one time Marshall was potentially on the trajectory of becoming a future cult classic filmmaking icon in the vein of John Carpenter, with how his films delivered minimalistic plots with stellar and evocative execution that never compromised on their uniqueness. However, Doomsday effectively put a dent in his filmmaking career when production company Rogue Pictures sold the distribution rights to Universal in the hopes that Doomsday would reach a larger global audience. The result was mixed reviews and commercial failure, and when the same thing happened again with Marshall's fourth film, another higher budget passion project called Centurion, it wasn't until nearly a decade later would Marshall return to cinema to admittedly disappointing results. However, it had nothing to do with Marshall's chops as a filmmaker. In fact, one could argue Doomsday essentially served as a bit of a calling card to demonstrate his genuinely impressive versatility as a director. Hell, during his hiatus from film, he directed plenty of big budget television like Black Sails, Hannibal, Westworld, Lost in Space, and most prominently, perhaps two of the best episodes of Game of Thrones. To me, his one crucial weakness was his lack of restraint as a writer, and even when we account for the one film in his career he did not write, Hellboy, he publicly disowned it due to intense studio interference that compromised on his sincere efforts to do the best with the material he was given. At the end of the day, Doomsday is emblematic of the disparity between Neil Marshall's ambitions as a writer and as a director, because when it stops to tell the story, it's mediocre at best. But when he's focusing on visual world building, nuggets of lore, and cool kick-ass set pieces, my god does the movie deliver where it's needed. Doomsday opens in 2008 Scotland, where the soon-to-be-named Reaper virus seems to emerge organically from nature deep within the city of Glasgow, leading to thousands of fatalities. Within a month, the UK government has built a wall around the country to prevent the virus from spreading into England, inevitably causing violence and hysteria to ensue when the military is suddenly ordered to seal the borders permanently during evacuation, dooming the surviving population to a dire fate comparable to the Black Death. It is an intense introduction, remnant of both 28 Days Later and its sequel, in that it not only shows how the virus spreads quickly and aggressively, but shows the brutal and bloody last resort of a government unable and perhaps unwilling to control the situation. We'll come back to that latter detail much later in the video, but for now, we're introduced to a mother trying to get her daughter out of Scotland after she's shot in the eye during the crossfire of the military's massacre. This little girl is our protagonist, who is symbolically named Eden. And why is she specifically shot in the eye? Because Snake Plissken also had an eye patch. In actuality, it's just a really cool, elaborate plot detail that pays off in the ending, but until we get to that, we jump forward to 2035, where Eden is now an elite secret agent for the UK government and has a prosthetic eye with a built-in camera. We see her in action in a satisfying, over-the-top infiltration mission to take down a drug shipment that serves to perfectly demonstrate Marshall's gleeful willingness to say yes to every idea that pops into his head. For example, there's some random naked lady in a bathtub with a shotgun during what's supposed to be a big-scale criminal syndicate operation, but fuck it, it's evocative and badass, don't overthink it. Now, Marshall has stated that much like Dog Soldiers, the film is layered with British humour and sensibilities, and I appreciate that self-awareness with how borderline farcical it can be be in many occasions, especially when it turns into Mad Max halfway through. What I feel truly highlights Marshall's infectious passion for subject matter is the finer details of the film's surprisingly compelling world building. Largely through visuals, we see how time has moved on, as a faded mural withers outside the now decaying quarantine walls, while the propaganda in Piccadilly Circus shows England has become an oppressive police state in retaliation to both the virus and civil unrest. It's explained that the army was initially left to continue dispatching stragglers around the wall until the survivors transitioned into cannibalism when supplies ran dry, and eventually the country one day fell into total darkness. However, the rest of Britain wasn't immune, as the world soon revoked their allegiance and trade, leaving the UK isolated to a gradual state of decay, with rampant unemployment, poverty, crime, and overpopulation, soon creating a hot zone for the virus to return. It's explained that in 2023, to mitigate flooding from the rising sea levels, the government extended the Thames River flood barriers and effectively created a castle moat around the centre of London, which they've now once again flooded to quarantine the virus to that specific hot zone. As the old saying goes, history is doomed to repeat itself, as the government's efforts mirror exactly what happened to Glasgow and subsequently all of Scotland. But to avoid hysteria and make it seem like they have their shit under control, the government assigned a covert team to breach the quarantine into Scotland in search of a cure. Satellite imagery reveals survivors still exist, despite claims that the country has become a dark zone, suggesting possible immunity and thus their blood can be used to develop a vaccine. The team are told they should start at a hospital in Glasgow where a certain Dr. Kean was originally developing a cure before it was suddenly abandoned. So after gearing up, they essentially enter this uncomfortably quiet landscape where modernity is reclaimed by nature. The transition into the quarantine is tense and visually striking. The quiet atmosphere is unsettling, and I really like the mix of semi-futuristic sci-fi and modern decay as they explore the relics of an old world layered with environmental storytelling. Yet, when they finally make it to the hospital, there is a sudden burst of violence, as they are immediately ambushed by punk rocker maniacs rejected from Mad Max looking to eat their faces, and if not Mad Max, you can insert Escape from New York or Ghosts of Mars in its place. It's a frantic and overwhelming surprise with some delightful kills, such as one of the drivers having their throat cut, but not before he drops a live grenade to take his killer out with him. The second truck is eventually overturned when the other driver gets shot in the throat, causing the group to put up a desperate last stand until Eden and the group's researcher Talbot get captured, forcing their leader Norton and another researcher called Sterling to go on the run. It's here where I imagine the film begins to lose people, because it veers into proper campiness when we're introduced to the leader of this vicious tribe of cannibals called Saul. To put it simply, he is delightfully deranged, and the whole Scottish-style Cirque du Soleil celebration they put on before their big human feast feels like a lampoon of that one day a year Britain can have a summer barbecue and piss up, paper plates and all. It's depravedly absurd, however, there's still no getting past the jarring shift in tone after the gritty B-movie bleakness that came before. Anyway, during this Mad Max Thunderdome setup, the gang of torture-loving sadomasochists barbarically cook Talbot alive, while Eden escapes and gets into a very underwhelming fight with Saul's crazed lover. Her death is surprisingly unceremonious because I expected more given how she was featured prominently in the film's marketing, but it's not technically the last we've seen of her. Before leaving, Eden rescues another prisoner called Callie, who is later revealed to be Saul's sister, and explains that Saul's tribe is at war with another faction led by the elusive Dr. Kean, who also happens to be their father. This will all make sense shortly. They miraculously regroup with Norton and Sterling, who spent their entire evening recreating the bus chase from the Warriors, and they all escape on a train, soon venturing into the Scottish Highlands where they are once again captured, this time by Kean's executioner, who takes them to Kean's castle. It's funny, you can actually pinpoint where one act ends and another begins just through sheer stylistic transition. The first act is dystopian future escape from New York, Act 2 is a subcultural fusion of Mad Max and the Warriors, and Act 3 is the literal Dark Ages. Now, as crazy as it sounds, I kind of like the concept behind what it's trying to do here. Sure, it's still ultimately just Neil Marshall making a buffet of his favourite films, but it's here where Doomsday disturbingly tries to make a point. However, this involves us going back to the beginning, so bear with me here. Speaking with Brian Gallagher of MovieWeb, Marshall explained that while the initial concept came from his reading about the Chernobyl exclusion zone, he built the story of Doomsday around Hadrian's Wall far north of England where he lived, which was a fortification erected by the Roman Empire in 122 AD during their attempt to conquer Britain. Whether explicitly intentional or not, this is specifically addressed in Kane's opening narration to establish a theme of territory that emerges throughout the story. Not only do you have the UK government segregating the population of London into zones, let alone isolating an entire country, but when we eventually venture into post-apocalyptic Scotland, we learn that there are effectively two rival armies battling for control. Both want to create a new world order under their own specific banner. One desires a monarchy under a sole ruler who wishes to preserve their land from the corruption of the rest of the world, while the other desires a republic, which involves invading the so-called promised land of England and reclaiming what they've been excluded from. Now, I do not want to get bogged down in UK geopolitics, but it's interesting how Marshall clearly intended a social theme, yet isn't aware to what extent it reaches. When interviewed by Mark Kermode and Simon Mayo on their popular film radio show when the film first came out, Mayo dry-wittingly pointed out how the premise of the UK government abandoning Scotland to its own devices was like a satirical joke on the recurring referendums about Scottish independence, but all of it just seems to go over Marshall's head as if he never intended such an interpretation.
I suppose it's one way of getting the government out of their sort of Scottish problem at the moment, isn't it? Do we call a referendum?
They do take a referendum on whether or not to do that and leave them all there.
But if everyone dies of a flesh-eating disease, then it's not going to be much of a referendum, is it really?
Yeah, it's kind of devolution taken to the extreme.
Yeah.
That's the thing, the commentary doesn't seem explicitly intentional within the film, but even I was jokingly telling myself the same idea before I came across this interview. However, and this is a big HOYEVER, when I looked at the wiki page again, because to be honest it's difficult to find sources for this film, something that jarringly stuck out to me was how apparently in the DVD commentary, it said that the film's true overarching villain, this shadowy government official called Canaris, who poorly hides his nefarious motives from the start, to quote, was depicted to have a fascist background, speaking lines that paralleled Adolf Hitler's mindset of cleansing. Okay, so if you're still with me, major spoiler revelations for the ending, but this guy basically tells Eden that he wants to let the virus to, quote, eat away the dead flesh, or in other words, kill off the population he deems inferior and undesirable before he creates a vaccine. As such, this is much more ghoulish than simply class conflict. It's about the purging of the poor and marginalized by the rich and the powerful. This isn't even implied. Dr. Kane himself explains that he gave up on creating the vaccine because he came to believe the virus was nature's way of selecting those worthy of the next stage of evolution, and thus the parallel with Canaris is that he's trying to play God by weaponizing a deadly virus to create a new world order that suits his ideology. In short, fuck me, Neil Marshall. That is some heavy subject matter to bury deep within your crazy genre film. In fact, it's shown that Kane has become so disillusioned and grief-stricken that he now rejects science completely and believes man must return to its earliest traditions, which does infer to a few ideological stances we even see today. Anyway, during all of this, back in London, the Reaper virus has long breached containment, and the Prime Minister, who seems ignorant to Canaris' goals throughout, ends up infected in the crossfire of an attack, causing him to execute himself, leaving Canaris to worm his way into power. Mad King Cian decides to pit Eden against the Executioner because Gladiator, I guess? I mean, it even activates the same sepia filter, which visually makes no sense when the film was cold, wet, moody greys and blues up to this point. I mean, since when did Scotland see the fucking sun? While the rest of the group escape and cause carnage, Eden kills the Executioner, and after reconvening, they make their way to an underground government shelter and get away in a brand spanking new Bentley because, like cockroaches, even advertising survives the apocalypse. In the midst of it, Norton gets a tragic platoon-style death, which is fairly sad because he is a likable character throughout, but we have a car to sell, and the climax, I swear to God, is literally a blatant commercial for Bentley. We're not even in fucking Scotland anymore. Last time I checked, Scotland didn't have a blistering hot mountainous desert in the middle of it. Genuinely, I had to look this up. I think they shot this climax in South Africa, where the group get into a frantic car chase with Saul's Mad Max rejects, while Two Tribes by Frankie Goes to Hollywood blasts in the... It's so great, but it's so absurd. Just go with it. Also, weirdly, a fitting song for the themes of the movie. The thing is, the most insane part about all of this is that this is a very technically ambitious scene for the budget that they had, and while it definitely goes on longer than it ought to, it's genuinely spectacular and exciting to watch, and I love that Saul even reattaches his crazed lover's head, only for it to conclude with him poetically losing his own. You know the way dogs get zoomies? Well, this is definitely the movie's version of it, where it just wants to burn off whatever energy it has left, and once it's all said and done, Callie and Sterling are evacuated to use her blood to create a vaccine, while Eden uses her eye camera, remember that, to secretly record and expose Canaris' diabolical cleansing goals to the world. Eden then returns to her childhood home in Glasgow and shares a tender moment with her mentor, before taking Saul's head and becoming the gang's new leader. The end, I guess? And I guess that's all there is to say about Doomsday. If you made it to the end, you might need a bit of a genre detox after all that, but thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay away from fascism, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.